So hi, my name is Wayne, and today I'm going to be talking to you all about some of the work that we're doing for the Mars 2020 onboard scheduler. So MSO, which is our previous rover mission to Mars, has been doing fantastic work on Mars. In fact, just recently we actually discovered some ancient organic material on Mars. But one of the challenges that MSO constantly faced was that it required a fixed ground schedule to be sent up to the rover in order for it to do its operations. This meant it wasn't really able to react to any execution variances. And as a result, it left a lot of time and energy on the table. So this is some data gathered by Dan Gaines, and it shows all the energy and time that could have been gained back, potentially gained back if we had an onboard scheduler. And so that's what we seek to do for Mars 2020. So over on the top, you'll see this medium drive that is going to end early. And for the onboard scheduler, we want to be able to shift the future activities forward in order to gain back that time due to an activity ending early. So scheduling is almost always done in the context of execution, and this is because reality almost always differs from our expectations. And we have to reschedule in order to handle these execution variances. But the issue is we don't have an instantaneous scheduler. In fact, far from it. So to give a little bit of context, the Mars 2020 rover uses two RAD 750s as its CPUs, and these are based off the PowerPC architecture, which was made when I was still in kindergarten doing arts and crafts. So they're very old, very slow. So we have to be able to handle what happens when the scheduler is running. So we have answered two questions. The first is, when do we reschedule? And the second is, what do we do while scheduling? So our driving use case is the Mars 2020 onboard scheduler, and for our objective function, we chose that as minimizing the make span, because we believe if we minimize the make span, we'll be able to show that there's extra time and energy that we were able to gain back with the scheduler. And we're going to focus on plans with the following attributes. Activities are approximately scheduled in a serial path for the plan. All the plans fit in the nominal schedule. Activities don't fail. They also don't run late. They actually only finish early, and this is because in MSO, I believe only 1 in 99 days of operations, only one activity in 99 days would fail. So it doesn't really happen very often. And also, activities don't preempt because we only use preemption as a special case for the Mars 2020 onboard scheduler. So this is a basic problem that we have where once the scheduler starts, it has to handle two issues. The first is that any activity in the future, it can't be rescheduled into the past, and I have to keep this in mind while time is marching forward. The second is that when time is marching forward while the scheduler is running, an activity can start executing. And now the scheduler has to take special care not to move around that activity. So we handle this by doing a commit window approach. And the commit window approach is essentially going to be this window of time that's created when the scheduler starts running. Now, in the commit window, any activity that has a scheduled start time inside the commit window won't be able to be rescheduled. And any activity that's outside of the commit window won't be able to be scheduled into the commit window. And so this will allow us to solve the two problems that I mentioned earlier. So the original approach we had to determining when to reschedule is this very simple fixed cadence scheduling. And all fixed cadence scheduling says is you reschedule at a fixed cadence. And we're actually going to simplify it a bit for our paper, where the cadence is actually going to be equal to scheduler runtime, and we're also going to simplify the commit window to be equal to the scheduler runtime. And that's usually going to be a conservative estimate of the scheduler runtime. And so there are two main types of losses that occur when you have fixed cadence scheduling and any type of execution, actually. And the first is the scheduler invocation loss. And this loss occurs because it's non-trivial for the scheduler to incorporate execution information. And more specifically, the Mars 2020 rover doesn't do so. As a result, you can have an activity that finishes early while the scheduler is running, and the scheduler won't know about that until the next time it's invoked. And so you have this loss that really just depends on whether or not you get lucky. If you get lucky and the scheduler invokes right after an activity ends, you'll be able to gain back all that time. But if not, then you have to wait until the scheduler finishes and re-invokes. The second type of loss is the scheduler runtime loss. So the scheduler runtime loss is because we have this commit window, and you want to schedule an activity from the future as early as possible, but you can't schedule into the commit window. So you're blocked by this scheduler commit window time. And that's our scheduler runtime loss. And so here's an example. You can see activity A will end early, but the scheduler doesn't know this. So it has to wait until the next time it's invoked before it can move activity B potentially up to that dotted line. And so our goal is to be able to shrink as much of that loss as possible. And this loss actually occurs per activity, so it can really add up over an entire schedule. So the second approach we tried was event-driven scheduling. And in this approach, you only invoke the scheduler when an event occurs. So you can see here that A ended early, and for us, that's an event. And the scheduler is able to invoke with that information in mind. As a result, it's able to move B up while it's scheduling, and now you're only left with this scheduler runtime loss. And so like I said, our events are activities ending more by delta amount of minutes. And we're really able to eliminate most of the scheduler invocation loss with event-driven scheduling. But there are some cases where you're not able to, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. There's also an additional benefit to doing event-driven scheduling, which is that you're probably going to be running the scheduler less times overall, which means that when the scheduler is running, you're able to allocate more of the CPU to it without worrying about starving lower priority CPU tasks. So here's an example where this doesn't hold. An activity will end early, and then the scheduler will invoke, but while the scheduler is invoking or running, activity C will end early as well. But since the scheduler is already started, it's not easy for us to decide whether or not you should reinvoke the scheduler. And for our case, we actually don't reinvoke the scheduler, which means that we have to wait until the next time the scheduler is invoked in order to move activity D up. And so B is able to get rid of that scheduler invocation loss, but D will suffer the scheduler invocation loss similar to fixed cadence scheduling. And so in order to avoid this, we have to determine a threshold or criteria so we don't reinvoke the scheduler needlessly. And so some criteria to consider would be what type of resource is it. For us, we care about energy, time, and data volume. How much of the resource changed, whether or not the activity that was involved with the event is a bottleneck, and whether or not this is a special case you want to consider. For example, if an activity actually failed on board the rover, you want to be able to reinvoke the scheduler. And if it doesn't fit these criteria, it may not be worth reinvoking the scheduler. So some challenges we faced with event-driven scheduling were, like I said before, we have to determine whether or not it's worth it to reinvoke the scheduler. So for our case, we chose not to, but there's been some work done on determining whether or not that's worth it. But that's beyond the scope of our paper, and it's also beyond the complexity of what we have for the rover. Another issue that we have to deal with is we assume that the scheduler would actually be invoked less times overall with event-driven scheduling, but that may not hold true if multiple events occur back-to-back. And so we want to avoid that so we don't starve out those lower priority tasks. So we have to set maybe a quota per a certain amount of period of time or throttle it somehow. And then there's the opposite issue. We actually don't have a completely accurate representation of certain resources such as energy because we use a linear representation, but it's not entirely linear. And so we want to reinvoke the scheduler periodically so that we're able to reschedule due to execution variances of those resources. So event-driven scheduling let us tackle issues with scheduler invocation loss, but we also want to tackle the issue of what happens when things end early inside the commit window. And so this is where flexible execution comes in. And flexible execution is really this separate process that runs at a much higher frequency, allows you to shift activities inside the commit window. And so this isn't a novel new concept. There's a lot of prior work on topics very similar to this, especially in simple temporal networks. But we're going to talk about how it applies to our scheduler. So this is the generic problem. Activity ends early inside the commit window, and then the scheduler can't do anything to reschedule it because it's already been committed. And so we're able to pull activities forward if we consider certain things. So we're going to consider certain resources like unit resources, consider whether or not it has dependencies, and we're also going to consider whether or not there's execution time constraints or maybe some set of activities because we might need to preheat that activity. And if there aren't any of these preconditions, then we can shift an activity forward with flexible execution. As a side note, we're also going to limit ourselves to pulling activities forward inside the commit window. It can actually be done outside of the commit window as well, but that introduces other complexities that we're still determining. So here's an example of a predecessor conflict. Basically, if you have activity A and C both sharing resources with activity B, activity A will end early, but you won't be able to move activity B forward. And here is another example where activity A will end early, and we're able to pull activity B forward with flexible execution, which would not be possible without it. And this is another bonus that we can do with flexible execution. If an activity runs late, even though I said we're not going to focus on this, you're actually able to push activities back with flexible execution as well. And normally with the scheduler, you might just have to reschedule that activity instead. So there are a lot of complications with flexible execution. Most notably, I conspicuously did not talk about energy when I said the resources we consider. And that's because energy is a depletable resource, and it's one of the more complex resources that we have to analyze. And if we can analyze it, well, then we wouldn't have flexible execution. We would just have our regular scheduler. And we need flexible execution to operate at a much higher frequency. So for our case, we actually just choose to ignore energy. And instead, we convince ourselves that the amount of energy that could change inside this commit window won't be enough to drastically affect our system. And then we add some padding to ensure that is the case. Also, flexible execution can cause even more inconsistencies in the schedule. As I said before, while the scheduler is running, execution variances can occur. Now, with flexible execution, you can pull activities around, and now the scheduler will be even more inconsistent. And so some empirical results that we did. So we ran our scheduler against two main types of plans. The first are synthetic plans. And these are plans that really followed our focuses. So they're completely serial by nature. All activities share the same resource bits. They don't have any execution time constraints, and they don't have any dependencies or setup activities as well. The other type of plan that we're dealing with are soul-type plans. So soul-type plans would be our best guess as to what might be representative of plans for Mars 2020 actual operations. And we had someone from MSO help us set this up. And we ran 30 different simulations for each type of soul-type and synthetic plan. So how we did this, basically we took data gathered by Dan Gaines for for MSL, and with it, there was the conservative duration that they sent up to the rover and the actual duration of how early the activities finish. And we discovered that activities, general end early, they end around 32% early, so they're pretty conservative when they're sent up. And with that, we crafted a normal distribution, and then we grabbed activity durations from that and changed activity durations during our simulation of execution. So for our synthetic plans, you can really see three trends. So does this work? Okay. Doesn't work. So the first trend is that as the scheduler runtime, which is the x-axis, increases, the amount of makespan gain we have, which is the y-axis, decreases. And the second trend that you can see, so the green line up there, that's event-driven scheduling without flexible execution. You can see that it drastically improves over the red line on the bottom, which is fixed cadence scheduling. And also you can see the purple line on top, which is event-driven scheduling with flexible execution. That, again, provides some improvement, but you can see that flexible execution has a better performance, especially when there is a longer scheduler runtime. So we also wanted to test to see if our predicted loss was correct. So if you remember, scheduler invocation loss is really just dependent on whether or not you get lucky. If you are able to invoke the scheduler right after an activity ends, you don't suffer it. And we said that we were able to get rid of this with event-driven scheduling. So you can see here we did a theoretical best makespan gain model, which would be an instantaneous scheduler. And we compared that against our scheduler's runtime. So you can see that the difference between the makespan gain of our scheduler versus the theoretical best makespan gain is actually equivalent to the predicted loss that we have. And so this shows that our model is actually pretty good when it comes to predicting loss when our assumptions hold true. But what about when it doesn't? So these are soul-type plans. And again, these plans are generally serial. They focus on the same things, but there may be some parallelism and some execution time constraints, and et cetera. And you can see that the same trends hold true. But when it comes to predicting loss, we're not able to do it because there are now execution time constraints, there are now parallelism and setup activities that can prevent activities from being pulled forward. And you can see we actually come still pretty close, especially when this scheduler runtime decreases down to 45 seconds. But there's still some work to be done on that. So there's a lot of future work we want to do. We want to further explore flexible execution. Like I said, there is we only explored pulling activities forward, but there's actually a lot of work done in pushing activities forward, and it's actually even more complex than pulling activities forward. We want to improve our objective function because right now we just want to minimize the makespan, but what might be a better objective function is actually determining how many optional activities we can put in if due to us gaining back those extra time, energy, and other resources. We said it's non-trivial to incorporate execution information, but it would also be nice to try that out as well. And we also want to have a better runtime model and have better runtime variations. So this might include actually letting activities fail or letting activities run late, because that, although uncommon for our rover operations, may still happen. And so in conclusion, we showed that rescheduling allows us to recoup some of the inefficiencies lost due to execution variances. We also showed that event-driven scheduling outperforms fixed cadence scheduling, especially in returning make-span gain. We also showed that flexible execution helps us reduce this loss, but it's quite complex because you have to deal with these complex resources, which we just chose to kind of ignore and add this padding. You also have to deal with this inconsistent schedule that it can generate from pulling activities forward and moving it around while the scheduler is running. So with that, thank you for listening to my talk, and if you have any questions.
All right, thank you, Wayne. Do we have any questions?
So you've assumed your scheduler has a fixed runtime. Have you considered the implication of running an anytime scheduling algorithm where you could just stop it when an event occurs and take what you've got at that point?
So we actually don't have a fixed runtime. So perhaps I didn't speak too clearly about that, but our scheduler runtime is actually uncertain. For our paper, we chose to assume that we're able to estimate the scheduler runtime, and we actually use some conservative estimates of that. But the scheduler runtime can actually be, I think right now it's between like 30 seconds to a minute. And so for our paper, we would choose like a minute as our scheduler runtime and analyze it that way. But it's actually not deterministic. And yeah. Does that answer your question, or was the other part of your question?
Have you consider using an anytime algorithm so that you can stop at the best result you have?
Okay, so I also didn't explain the schedule in the system. So we have a very simple scheduler. So it actually is, but what it does is it doesn't do any backtracking or any search really. It just places down activities one by one according to their priority order. So if you stopped in the middle, actually, what would happen is you just would have a worse schedule than if you continued. And you might have to stop if you run out of time. For example, that's something we're still considering. But our scheduler is very simple. It's not going to be you're searching for an optimal solution and trying to figure that out, and you reach a feasible solution before you get to that optimal solution. Instead, you're just placing activities down one by one, never removing them after you place them down. And this is really because, like I said, we use pretty low-powered CPUs, and also that has to be shared with other CPU tasks, which might seem disappointing to you guys because you guys are scheduling people, and you want the whole CPU for the scheduler.
All right, other questions? Was there one up here? Okay.
I had one question, but I think you partially answered. So can you do in parallel, for example, schedule it before, so you know that your last task is end in, let's say, 30 seconds. Can you plan in advance that after the 30 seconds?
So you're saying if I know the activity will end in 30 seconds? Or?
Yeah, so that you do planning more or less before your last, as I saw you execute your plan, then you have a scheduling, and then again executing new plan, right?
So let me know if I'm answering your question wrong, but we won't know if an activity is going to end in 30 seconds because we would be able to determine, like, based off of the nominal schedule when an activity would end. But if it's the nominal schedule, according to event-driven scheduling, you just wouldn't invoke the scheduler because then nothing's really changed. And if something does change, then we wouldn't be able to predict that, right? Because an activity can end 30 seconds early, a minute early, 5 minutes early, and it would just, and you wouldn't be able to predict how much time is left while running the activity. I don't know if that was your question or not, though.
But so if you have changes in parallel, as you showed, can you just stop any time your plan and then incorporate
over here?
new change? Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, you could potentially stop it here, stop it right there, and re-invoke the scheduler. And that's, in the next slide, I talk about how there's research done on determining whether or not you should do that. We just choose not to do that because it's kind of complex. You have to determine whether or not it's worth it to stop the scheduler and re-invoke. Because if you do stop the scheduler and re-invoke, then now you're able to get this information that D moves earlier, but now B will have this scheduler invocation loss. So it's a trade-off between the two. And you have to kind of determine whether it's worth it in that case. You kind of just wasted time because you started the scheduler and then you have to toss away your schedule and restart.
And you can potentially do not stop scheduling, never.
Yeah, but then you're going to schedule with an inconsistent schedule because the previous schedule was built with C being like long, and so you can't really use the old schedule because, again, we just have this simple algorithm that places activities down, and it doesn't do like searching and backtracking and stuff like that.
All right, let's thank Wayne one more time and move on to the next speaker.